You know, they always say that hindsight is 20/20, but looking back at April 10th, 1912, hindsight was more like a cruel cosmic joke. If you were standing there with me on the docks of Southampton, you wouldn't have seen a doomed vessel. You would have seen the literal peak of human arrogance, wrapped in black paint and white enamel. I remember standing there, squinting against the sun, watching this absolute mountain of steel tower over the pier. People were weeping, not out of sadness, but because they were looking at something they thought was impossible. It was the Olympic class, the queen of the ocean. And I was lucky enough, or so I thought, to have a ticket. I remember the smell most vividly. It wasn't the sea yet. It was the smell of fresh lead paint, expensive cigar tobacco, and the faint underlying scent of thousands of pounds of coal being shoveled into the belly of the beast. It felt like the world was starting over, and we were the chosen ones moving into the future. I walked up that gangplank feeling like a king, even though my cabin was barely big enough to swing a cat in. But hey, that's first-class travel for you in the Edwardian era. You're paying for the privilege of being able to say you were there. The first few days were, quite honestly, a bit of a bore, which is the ultimate irony. We were cruising through the Atlantic at a clip that made the water look like white lace being torn apart. I spent a lot of my time in the gymnasium, which, looking back, was hilarious. There was this electric horse and an electric camel. I remember watching a wealthy businessman, in a full suit and a handlebar mustache, bobbing up and down on a mechanical camel, looking dead serious about his fitness while a steward watched with a completely straight face. That was the Titanic experience. It was peak luxury mixed with total absurdity. I'd spend my afternoons in the veranda cafe, surrounded by real palm trees. Yes, they had palm trees in the middle of the North Atlantic, sipping tea and listening to people talk about how the ship was essentially a floating, unsinkable fortress. The captain could hit an iceberg at full speed and we'd just nudge it aside, someone told me over a plate of oysters. I remember nodding, thinking, yeah, that sounds scientifically accurate. We were all so convinced of our own invincibility. It's funny how a few million tons of steel can make you feel like you've conquered nature itself. Sunday, April 14th, started out like any other day, but the air had changed. It was bitingly cold. I mean, the kind of cold that feels like a physical weight on your chest. By the evening, the sea was like a sheet of glass. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Usually, the ocean has a heartbeat, a swell, some whitecaps. But that night, it was dead still. It was beautiful, in a haunting, eerie way. I remember being in the smoking room, the wood paneling glowing under the electric lights, the sound of ice clinking in glasses. People were laughing, talking about real estate and the new world waiting for us in New York. We were making record time. Captain Smith was the millionaire's captain, the safest pair of hands in the business. We felt untouchable. I went to bed around 11 p.m., complaining to my steward that the room was a bit chilly. He laughed and told me he'd bring an extra blanket. That was the last time I saw him. Then came the vibration. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a Hollywood explosion with fire and screaming. It was just a shudder, like the ship had run over 1,000 marbles. I remember sitting up in bed, looking at my water glass on the nightstand. The water was rippling, but the ship had stopped. And that was the weirdest part. The silence. When those massive engines stopped, the silence was deafening. It was as if the heart of the world had just stopped beating. I threw on a heavy overcoat, not even bothering with a tie. God forbid I face a crisis without a tie, and stepped out into the corridor. People were poking their heads out, looking more annoyed than scared. We were all thinking the same thing. What now? Did we drop a propeller? I walked up to the boat deck, and that's when I saw it. Or rather, I saw what was left of it. There were chunks of ice scattered across the well deck. People were actually picking them up, playing football with the ice, laughing about how they could use it for their drinks. It was a comedy of errors. We were standing on a dying giant, and we were literally playing with the weapon that killed it. I remember seeing Thomas Andrews, the designer of the ship. He didn't look like a man who was having a good night. He was carrying a roll of blueprints, and his face was the color of ash. I followed him at a distance toward the bridge, and I caught a glimpse of his face as he spoke to Captain Smith. That was the moment my stomach dropped. It wasn't just concern. It was the look of a man who had done the math and realized the answer was 0. 5 compartments were flooded. The ship could float with 4. It was simple, cold, unforgiving arithmetic. I walked back toward the lounge and the band had started playing. People think they played Nearer, My God, to Thee the whole time. But in the beginning, they were playing ragtime. They were playing Alexander's Ragtime Band. It was jaunty, upbeat, and completely surreal. The ship was slowly tilting forward. The floor was becoming an incline. And there were these musicians in their best suits, playing pop hits to keep us from panicking. It was the most British thing I've ever seen. The confusion started as a slow burn. The stewards were going door to door, telling people to put on their lifebelts, but they were doing it with such a calm, "Don't worry, it's just a precaution" tone that nobody took it seriously. I saw a woman refuse to leave her cabin because she couldn't find her favorite hat. Another man was complaining that he'd paid for a full voyage and didn't want to sit in a drafty lifeboat. We were so insulated by our own wealth and the marketing of the White Star Line that we couldn't conceive of the ship actually disappearing. But then, the rockets started. The boom of the distress flares echoed off the water, lighting up the sky in a ghostly white glare. That's when the mood shifted. A flare isn't a precaution. A flare is a scream for help. I watched them uncover the lifeboats. That was the first time I felt true, cold-blooded fear. You see, when you're standing on the deck of the Titanic, the lifeboats look like toys. They looked like they belonged on a different, much smaller ship. And there weren't enough of them. Everyone knew it, but seeing it was different. It was like having 20 people at a dinner party and only 8 chairs. I watched Second Officer Lightoller, a man who looked like he was carved out of granite, trying to maintain order. "Women and children first," he shouted. It sounds noble, but in practice it was heartbreaking. I saw families being ripped apart. I saw men kissing their wives goodbye, promising they'd be on the next boat or that they'd see them in New York tomorrow. They knew they were lying. Their wives knew they were lying. But they all played their parts in this tragic play because the alternative was too horrifying to voice. The irony of the unsinkable ship became a physical weight as the bow sank lower. The water was now reaching the grand staircase. That beautiful, ornate, wood-carved masterpiece was being swallowed by the Atlantic. I remember seeing a silver serving tray floating past $1 million chandelier. The juxtaposition of extreme wealth and raw, uncaring nature was staggering. I found myself near Boat 13. It wasn't full. They were actually struggling to find people who wanted to get in. Can you believe that? People were staying on the warm, brightly lit ship because the idea of being lowered 60 feet into a black, freezing void in a wooden rowboat seemed more dangerous. I saw a man I'd shared a drink with earlier. John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship. He was standing there, calm as you like, asking if he could join his wife. He was told no. He just nodded, stepped back, and touched his cap. Wealth didn't matter anymore. Your bank account doesn't give you buoyancy. I ended up in a boat by sheer luck. A steward literally shoved me toward a lowering boat and yelled, "Go on then, we need more weight to balance it." As I was lowered down the side of that steel cliff, the scale of the tragedy became clear. I looked at the rivets, thousands of them, passing by my face as we descended. I looked up and saw the rows of portholes, still glowing with warm yellow light, while people leaned over the railings looking down at us like we were the ones in trouble. When we hit the water, it was a shock. The boat slapped the surface, and suddenly, we were tiny. The Titanic wasn't a ship anymore. It was a mountain that was falling over on top of us. We rode. We rode like our lives depended on it. Mostly because they did. We had to get away from the suction. Or so we thought. From the water, the sight was hauntingly beautiful. The ship was standing on its head. The stern was rising out of the water, the three massive propellers silhouetted against the stars like some kind of alien architecture. The lights stayed on. That's the thing people forget. The engineers, the men down in the hold, they stayed at their posts to keep the dynamos running so we could see, so the wireless could keep sending SOS. They were dying in the dark so we could have light. And then, the sound started. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of the ship breaking. It sounded like a forest being crushed. The steel was groaning, the rivets were popping like gunfire, and then, darkness. The lights flickered once, twice, and went out. Then came the big break. The ship literally snapped in two. I saw the stern settle back into the water for a second, and for a heartbeat I thought, maybe it'll stay afloat. But no. The bow, filled with water, dragged the stern up into the air again. It stood perfectly vertical, a black pillar against the Milky Way, and then it just slid. It didn't go down with a roar, it went down with a hiss. And then the sound started, the sound of 2,500 people in the water. It's a sound you never get out of your head. It wasn't a chorus of screams. It was a low, persistent moan, like a million bees. It sounded like a stadium full of people all sighing at once. We sat in that boat for hours. The temperature was below freezing. Every time I moved, the air felt like a knife. I remember looking at the stars. Because there was no light pollution and the air was so dry, the stars were so bright they looked like they were falling. It was the most beautiful sky I've ever seen, over the most horrific scene I've ever experienced. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We just listened to the silence grow as the voices in the water slowly, one by one, went quiet. The cold is a merciful killer in that way. It just puts you to sleep. When the Carpathia finally appeared on the horizon, it didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a ghost. This little Cunard liner, throwing off sparks from its funnels because it was pushing its engines harder than they were ever meant to go. They pulled us up in rope slings. I remember stepping onto the deck of the Carpathia and a steward handing me a cup of coffee. It was the worst coffee I've ever had, and it was the best thing I've ever tasted. I looked around at the other survivors. We were a ragtag group of millionaires and coal shovelers, all wrapped in the same gray blankets, all staring at the horizon with the same blank look in our eyes. Looking back, surviving the Titanic wasn't about bravery. It was about being in the right place at the wrong time, and then the right place at the right time. We were the generation that thought we had conquered nature. We had the biggest ship, the best tech, and the most money. And the ocean just shrugged. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes for the greatest achievement of the 20th century to become a memory. Sometimes I wonder if we ever really learned the lesson. We still build things and call them invincible, and we still act surprised when the icebergs show up. But every time I hear the sound of ice clinking in a glass, I'm right back there, on the deck, under those impossible stars, watching the unsinkable disappear into the black. It's a funny thing, memory. It keeps you warm, but it also keeps you shivering. Anyway, that's my story. Not as heroic as the movies, maybe, but I was there. I saw the lights go out, and I'm still here to tell you that the ocean doesn't care how much your ticket cost. It really doesn't.